Okay, good morning, everyone. I think that's everyone in. If I could just ask as an initial point, sorry, I'm hearing some noises, if everyone could just mute their microphones, with the exception of me, of course. That would be good. So it's 9:30, time to reopen the virtual hearings into the North Warwickshire local plan. Can everyone see and hear me? I will take silence as a yes. Okay. So thank you all for being here, for your contributions today, and for your patience. In the event there are any hiccups in the virtual format we're in. Many, and I'm just looking through the individuals, if not all of you who are intending on participating today will be familiar with proceedings. The aim is to replicate as closely as possible what we would have done in a physical hearing, albeit on Microsoft Teams. I know many of you tuned into the session yesterday and in the morning of yesterday, where I gave a fuller explanation of where we are in the examination, and the council updated on various things that had changed. Nevertheless, and with apologies for repeating myself, it's important to set out a few procedural points, so please bear with me. I'm Tom Bristow, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination and to ultimately prepare a report with recommendations to the council. This morning, the discussion will be structured around paragraphs 36 to 44 of examination document INSP 5B. That sets out the matters that I intend to raise for discussion and is a working agenda for today. I'll try and be simple in what I say and avoid any acronyms, but where I do say things like that, like INSP 5B, generally they refer to examination documents on the examination website or library. Now that is maintained by Kerry Truman, the programme officer, who is on the line, and it's hosted on the council's website. Other acronyms, probably the main one to reference is the 2012 version of the National Planning Policy Framework, the basis for the examination. That's the NPPF. Other key documents will be referring to the latest schedule of potential main modifications, or MMs, that's NWBC 20E. But please do interject or stop me to clarify anything if anything is unclear. So there's guidance on the examination website on data privacy and virtual hearings. Those documents are INSP 22, INSP 23 and INSP 24. Do have a look through those documents if you haven't already done so, as it's relevant to what we're doing here and the format that these sessions take. So the sessions will be an informal discussion led by me on certain matters. I will generally summarise what I see to be the key issues and invite comments from various parties to make sure we make most efficient use of our time. As I've checked in previous sessions, have we got anyone that's joined via telephone? It doesn't look like it from what I can see. And I just mention that because the sort of functions of Teams differ if you are joining by telephone, but no one has said yes, so that keeps things simple. All questions or points should be put to me in the first instance rather than any form of cross-examination. I'll then determine what further discussion or information is needed, or which points to make particular note of as we go forward. In terms of Microsoft Teams, this meeting is being live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel, and it's also, and it'll be available for a short time there. It's also being recorded on Teams until my report, and shortly thereafter is with the Council. So with that in mind, just take care not to share any personal information, whether that's yours or personal information of other people, whether it's verbally or by holding things up to the camera, etc. Now, as all of you have done, which I think is the best approach, if you turn off your camera, but just appear magically when you want to speak, you can, of course, mindful of privacy, obscure your background with something appropriate. You may, of course, wish to leave your camera off when you speak, but just let me know who you are and your particular interest when you do speak or contribute. Again, please mute your connection when you're not speaking. It seems like everyone has done that. In terms of timings, we'll see how we go. There's inevitably needs to be some flexibility in what we do. But as yesterday, my intention is to have a short break around 11. So a short break around 11, and then to come on to the afternoon sessions to conclude this one around about 1 or thereabouts. Once the session ends, so at lunch, I'll ask you to disconnect or hang up. That's the, you may all be familiar, but that's the red rectangle with the phone icon and leave in it. You may, if you've said what you want and you've heard enough, you may, of course, disconnect in that way at any time, and that doesn't affect proceedings. And of course, Kerry, the programme officer, and the council are there to assist if something goes awry or if there are any accidental leavers. If you do wish to speak, oh, sorry, I should say that during the break, though, so that's at lunch. During the break, don't hit the leave button. Just simply keep your video and audio off, and we'll leave the recording running during that period rather than everyone coming out and then coming back in. I'll explain that when we get to that point. If you wish to speak, and only those who made representations are entitled to do so, please use the raise hand function. That's the palm symbol on the taskbar. I can. Good morning, Mr. Sargent.
Good morning.
If I could possibly ask you just for the time being to mute your microphone, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
We won't be using the chat function. There's a chat function, obviously, in Teams. We won't be using that. If anyone does accidentally use that, I won't look at it. Nor will we be using really the shared screen facility. Although yesterday I thought it was useful for me alone to use that to highlight certain things, and I might do that again. I'm not sure, but generally we won't use that. As you've seen, I may, of course, look around, write notes, source documents. Please don't be offended if you see me doing that. I will be listening. And of course, there may be occasional technical issues, but I'm sure we will be able to resolve those as we go. And thank you very much to the Council and the Programme Officer for the work that they've put into enabling this hearing today. So, if there are no technical or administrative points, I'll just deal with a few other bits and pieces before we come on to the substance of the discussion. The first point is that any information related to the examination should already be with me or on the examination website. Just practically, it may be useful, as I have, to have the 2012 version of the NPPF in front of you, particularly paragraph 182, which deals with soundness, alongside examination document CD11, which is the plan as submitted, and examination document NWBC20E, which is the latest schedule of potential main modifications or MMs that I may ultimately recommend the plan is sound, subject to the incorporation thereof. Given the time at examination, what we covered yesterday, it may not be necessary to cover each and every matter in INSP 5B. Please keep any contributions succinct, and as you'll have seen from my introduction, I'm a notable exception to that. I may stop you if I've heard enough, if we've already discussed certain issues in previous sessions, whether that's recently or indeed the earlier sessions in previous years into the plan. Please don't take offence if I do that. It's simply that part of the process is exploring the issues and clarifying them rather than giving a finding here and now, and I may have enough on which to reach a recommendation. I'd lastly say that the examination only concludes when my report is with the council, and there'll be opportunity for further comment on potential main modifications, which will be a particular focus of discussion, including on Thursday afternoon. So at that stage, before we turn to paragraph 45 of INSP 5B, before we turn to paragraph 36, I knew there was something wrong there. 36 of INSP 5B. Are there any procedural questions, any matters anyone wants to raise at this stage? And I'll just pause for a minute to see if there are any hands up or if anyone raises anything. Okay. So first and foremost, which I have nearly forgotten, is to do a quick roll call. The sort of the reason for that is just to check that everyone is here who I'm expecting, and equally to check if anyone is here that I'm not expecting, and that everyone's systems work. So if I could just, if I do a sort of roll call, and if you just say yes, that will be fantastic. So from the council, I have Dorothy Barrett, Mike Dittman, and Susan Wilson.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I also have on my list Mr. Best.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. David Hodgetts.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And is it just you today, or have we got Doug Han and Edward?
Yes, sir. It's Doug Han here.
Yes, sir, Edward, sir.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. Good. You're all on my list. Have we got also Peter Lever?
Yep.
Good.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Oh, yes. Mr. Sitch?
Good morning, sir. Yes.
And you have got two hats on, is that right today?
It's just acting for Stoford this morning, sir.
Stoford this morning, thank you.
Stoford, thank you.
Mr. Rouse?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. And Mr. Sargent?
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you all. Is there anyone here who I haven't mentioned? Okay. Thank you very much. Right. So let's turn to paragraph 36 of INSP 5B. So I've put in this section, as I have in others, a little bit of the history to where we have arrived at this juncture of the examination. So we have table 8 of the plan as submitted, which sets out figures in terms of employment land provision. That has since been supplemented, and we had a lot of discussion about AD52 and AD52A. Those are sort of two sides of the same coin. There was a lot of debate about them in the last session on employment land in terms of what they show in relation to figures and forecasts. This question is principally getting to an update of that position, by the way. AD52A puts completions of employment-related land. Sorry, that doesn't quite make sense, but it puts the figure of what has come forward between 2011 to 2018 at 154.8 hectares. I see the council's position at that juncture was that should be 142 hectares. Can I just get any views from the council as to whether those documents, so whether the council's position is maintained that figure should be 142 hectares?
If you'll see, so that's up to 2018. So as of 2018, yes, we take it as 142. We haven't changed our position on that. We can update it to 2019 if you wish.
We had a fair bit of discussion yesterday, and just refresh my memory. I think I'm right in saying that the housing land supply situation, the latest monitoring year was in fact 2018 to 2019.
It is, sir.
So I think it would be prudent to make those data sets align, if you see what I mean. So if there is data from 2018, 2019, I think then that would bring that data on employment land in line with housing.
In that case, it's still the 142 up to 2017-18, plus a further 25.08, which brings the number of completions to 167.08 or 167.
167.08 hectares. And that's the council's position as correct of the 2018 to 2019 monitoring year.
That's correct, sir. Then the I was going to jump on to the outstanding planning permissions. At the time, it was 78 that was in 17-18. It's now 69.12.
Can you just say those again? Sorry. So in 2017, 2018, it was
78 hectares.
Yeah.
But it's now come down to 69.12 because of some of those have now been completed. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So they've sort of changed category. So as I have it, correct of 2018, 2019 in the council's from the council's perspective is that there are since 2011, 2012, 167.08 hectares of some form of employment land has been delivered. Up to during the monitoring year 2018-2019, 69 hectares was effectively in the pipeline of stuff that had consent. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Thank
and then
you.
The allocations then in the table before you, it's the 73.2 is what we put in that final column, but actually it should be go back to the 57.2 hectares, because that then marries up with the allocations within the main modifications and in the local plan.
Okay, so the components then of the sort of total include 57.2 hectares, and that relates to allocations as they stand at this point in time, and presumably that is unchanged since 2018-2019.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And that comes to 293 hectares.
Okay, so that sort of totals to 293 hectares, which, and I put in INS P5B that when I wrote that, we were looking at somewhere around 250 hectares. So that's a difference there. Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Were there any more? Sorry, I'm conscious I interrupted you quite a few times in setting out those figures. Were there any more points you wanted to make? Then I'll ask for any sort of points on that from any of the participants in this session.
No, so that's the update so that they marry up with the housing monitoring year.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear in terms of numbers. Does anyone want to comment on those figures at all? So I've got 2 hands up at the moment. I didn't quite see, it was a bit of a photo finish as to who raised their hands first there, but let me take, I think it was, let me take Mr. Best first and then Mr. Lever. Mr. Best.
Thank you, sir. Yes, you'll remember, and in fact, I had to remind myself about the derivation of AD 52A and AD 52B. But in reminding myself of that, there was a particular passage of discussion in one of the sessions back in April 2019, I think, where we were contributing to the discussion. I think that was being led by Mr. Rouse and the figures that Savills had produced. And a question was asked about Coleshill Hall Hospital. And I've got it in front of me here, AD 52, sorry, B, which is has the additional councils column, which is in blue text. And then there's a column in red text, which is the Savills text, if you have that to hand.
And that's in AD 52B. 2 seconds, I will just get that to hand. Yeah.
So it's table 7, sites with planning permission.
I'm getting there. Sorry for the delay. Table 7. I'm there. I'm at table 7, and you said it was Coleshill Hall Hospital, the first first row.
The first entry, the first row is Coleshill Hospital. So the red text is that provided by Savills with, I think, my edits to that, which was explaining the reasons why we didn't think that site should be being counted as part of the supply any longer. And the council's response is the council refers to MM122 and feels this should remain 16.38. And I remember at the time the council said it was still an extant planning permission, and therefore, you know, it's the site area of the planning permission should still be counted. I mean, the present day situation is that part of that site has now been compulsory acquired by HS2 and is in fact under construction for the West Line. The remainder of the site is obviously still owned by IM Properties, but currently or shortly won't have an access until HS2 provide an alternative access. And therefore, any balance of the planning permission is currently not implementable, and in any event certainly isn't 16.38 hectares worth of land. And given the figure that Dorothy Barrett's just given of 69.12 hectares remaining with planning permission, I've just quickly calculated that 16.38 hectares is roughly a quarter of what's remaining with planning permission. So I think it's a slightly disproportionate figure, and I would contend that our position that it shouldn't be regarded as 16.38 hectares worth of land supply is still a valid point.
Okay. Yep. No, that's all very clear. I mean, you mentioned, was it main modification 112? Is that? I think I know what that does in substance. I know the sort of the substance of what you're referring to, but I'm just trying to to find that particular one.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry to just come in. There is an anomaly at the time that MM122 was created. I think it came from the initial changes that you were undertaking for the modifications numbers.
Right.
We have had a query on MM122 and the 116. They basically they reflect two other modifications within NWBC 20, which I think is their class as MMXs, but we did struggle to identify the specifics of MM122 because this goes back to July last year.
Yeah, and I think this is something that probably we'll encounter a fair few times, and probably I should take responsibility for the number of versions of NWBC 20E, the schedule of main modifications. As I see it in NWBC 20E, Mr. Best, is that in fact MM 61, which is Chas and Element proposals for the replacement of lawful buildings, structures and uses, including those with permission, if demolition or removal is required by HS2. Sorry, I've
right, sorry.
Which one? Yeah.
MM
61.
Yeah.
So as I as I understand it, there's 16.38 hectares, which is there in AD 52B. Your point is that is affected or taken out by High Speed 2, and I think in referring to potential main modification 112, I think that in the NWBC 20 is in fact MM 61. Is that right?
Sorry, sir. Yes, I think that's correct from what we recall. And we did state and have stated fairly strongly that any implications from HS2, and particularly in terms of relocation, redevelopment and replacement of lost buildings, the council have indicated we are willing to accommodate as an exception effectively to Greenbelt. And particularly with regard to the Coleshill Hall Hospital, the main elements that were affected by HS2 were, and if I recall, it's the Subaru Regional Office complex and associated offices around that. They were already completed. My understanding, and Dorothy Barrett will be able to just potentially help on that, but the remaining area is what we were referring to in the 16.38. And we still believe that is deliverable and it is available. It is an extant consent from a consent that has commenced. And to give an example of our willingness to accommodate significant commercial developments within that area and the potential, and what I'm trying to focus on here is the potential for them coming, because the assumption is that because of HS2, nothing is going to happen in this corridor. That is incorrect. We have recently granted consent not only for the Wall of Prayer, a significant national monument, and the Commonwealth Games surf. I'm not quite sure what the formal title is, but it's the surf complex for the demonstration as part of the Commonwealth Games. Literally 100 yards, 200 yards from this site to the west along the boundary with the M6. So if I can just sort of refer to that, that shows our willingness to be A, accommodating, B, to accommodate existing extant consents where they have been granted in the past, and our willingness to enable further development. So I do have some dispute with IM's suggestion that they would not be willing to deliver the remaining area of their extant consent, given the willingness the Borough Council has to enable that to happen.
Thank you. I mean, that's very clear, and I'll come back to you, Mr. Best. I mean, I think setting aside sort of any general points of willingness, and I appreciate that was a very clear statement you made, Mr. Dittman, but I think it was more of a technical or numerical point that Mr. Best was raising in terms of how that 16.38 hectares is attributed. It wasn't necessarily commenting on the approach in MM61 or the council's perspective as I saw it.
And so if I could just add to that, yes, I mean, I very much welcome what Mr. Dittman said, and if that's the interpretation that the council will place on MM61, if it becomes part of the plan, it's currently a proposed main modification, then that's clearly something that will be helpful. But yes, what we're dealing with here is an employment land supply table, which should deal with planning permissions and genuine supply. What we're talking about there is the supposition that at some point in the future, planning permission might be obtained for an alternative form of development in the green belt to replace that lost to HS2. So I think that's a slightly different question to whether or not it should be continue to be counted in the supply. And I come back to the point, and it's a really simple point, which is 16.83 hectares is the total red line site area of a site which is in the green belt and contains the conversion of an existing list building and the development of 10,000 square metres of additional floor space, of which roughly a third has been developed and 2/3 hasn't. So it's not 16.83 hectares of land in the conventional sense as you would normally expect to have in a land supply table.
Okay, I think that's very clear.
And given that it contributes a quarter of that land, the remaining supply of land, my point is it's a disproportionate amount of that supply.
Yeah.
If it was one of many sites that were part of that supply, then it would be negligible, and therefore the fact that it wouldn't contribute very much in terms of actual floor space and actual jobs would be a lesser point. But I think its significance as a proportion of the whole is the main point that I'm making. But I equally welcome Mr. Dittman's point about how that policy would be applied in the future, and I'm sure that will give some comfort to IM, and also welcome the approval of both the monument and the surf lagoon, both of which we were involved in getting planning permission for, and both of which were considered partly to be appropriate in the Greenbelt. So they're not quite comparable to an employment development in the Greenbelt, but I certainly welcome the inference.
Thank you. So turning to the sort of numerical point or the categorisation of that, any points that the council would like to make? I mean, I've heard the I've heard the issues there, but yeah.
If I could just make some points there, that as far as I'm aware, HS2 has only recently taken over the land, and if we're doing the position as of 1819, then it is correct to say that the majority of that site was available in the 1819 monitoring year. I do accept that the issue of HS2 taking over some of their land is an issue, but equally the line is supposed to be open by 2026, 28, so, and the plan period is up to 33. So in my opinion, that means that there is some leeway there, that there will be development before the end of the plan period. So it's not quite as you have with housing, where it has to be, the 5-year housing land supply has to be immediate. The allocations are there for the plan period, and I believe that they are there. So.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think I've heard what I need to on that particular one, and I said I would come to Mr. Lever. Thank you, Mr. Best, and to the council for making those contributions very clear. Mr. Lever.
Thank you. Yeah, it was actually me who raised the query about MM122 a couple of weeks ago. And
thank you for that. I did see that.
Thanks for the explanation. Just to take the point a little bit further, or just to look at it in a slightly different way, because like Mike Best, I don't actually see this site contributing significantly to the land supply for the borough in actually dealing with its need. And I think there's an apples and pears approach here. But my understanding from how GL Hearn have determined local need is through either a labour demand or a labour supply model. I can't recall which, but it essentially generates a floor space, and then from there it generates a hectarage, and that hectarage is generally based on I think it's a 40% site plot ratio. Here, there is a current permission for about 10,000 square metres, some of which has been implemented. But if you just, for the sake of make maths easy, 10,000 square metres of floor space would require only 2.5 hectares of developable area at 40% site ratio. So therefore, I don't think it is representative to put 16.38 hectares as actually the contributing hectarage. Instead, you should be looking at the developable area, because that is realistic, and it is also it's keyed into actually the determination of need.
And the developable area, can I ask you what that would be in your view?
Sorry, it's 2.5 hectares. I've done half
Mm-hmm.
hectares. The way I've worked that out, very simply, broadly, there's permission for 10,000 square metres. Yeah, at 40% site or plot ratio, that requires a site of 2.5 hectares. Yeah, it will actually be less than that. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
I was just writing that down.
Okay, yes. Sorry, is that clear?
Yeah, that's clear. I suppose not knowing that site in detail, the rest is occupied by the former hospital. Is that right?
I believe that the 10,627 square metres that's referenced by Savills in AD 52A is the total permission, the total level of floor space. Some of that has actually been, I believe that some of that has been consented. Sorry, has been implemented. So the 10,627 square metres is a maximum figure based on the extant planning permission. Right. I've tried to make the maths as simple as possible by approximating it, and but you see the point I'm making. This isn't a site that's going to contribute 16.38 hectares. It's going to contribute significantly less, and that's of course if the site isn't blighted by HS2.
Okay, yep, points very clearly made. Mr. Best, and then I'll go back to the council.
Sorry,
unless there was anything else, Mr. Levy, you wanted to say.
I've got 2 more points, actually. First of all, I'm not sure that AD 52B has got quite right the position with Core 42 in terms of completions and land available. And what I suggest is that I send an email to either Dorothy or Mike just to set out the exact position with that in terms of completions to 2019 and land available.
Can I just press you as to what the kind of significance of the difference is, just simply so that we can talk about it if needs be there?
I think it's just to make sure that the table is fully accurate. I'm not sure that the table fully captures all the completions to date to the end of 2019 and the land available as from 2019.
But you're not, or are you suggesting there's a significant difference? I mean, just so that, because this is the opportunity to sort of talk that through, and if there is a significant difference, I'd like to talk about it now.
I don't believe there is a significant difference now.
Okay. Yep. Well, I mean, certainly you're absolutely right that plans need to be up to date on based on up to date and robust evidence. So if that is something the council is amenable to considering to make sure that's absolutely accurate, I have no problem with that.
We're happy to offer that. My third point is, and I do apologise, this is my first session on this local plan.
Sure.
So I'm bound to ask some really silly questions or make some observations that have been made before.
That's never stopped me. So.
Right. Okay. But one thing, I'm going through the submission draft and then the main modifications. I couldn't really understand the reasoning for Table 8 to change. Table 8 in the submission draft just considered local supply or supply of sites to meet local need. This table seems to provide the supply of all sites, whether to meet local need or a wider need. And there's no explanation for why that's happened. And my concern is that there isn't an apples versus apples approach here. A local need has been derived, rightly or wrongly, and we'll come on to that. But the actual allocations and the site supply has been done on everything, both the local sites and sites that deal with a wider need. And I didn't really understand why that approach had been taken.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I can help explain that one, and then the council can chip in anything further they would like. And in one of the previous sessions, there was a lot of discussion about how the employment land figures have been calculated with reference to quote unquote, and I have to be very careful what I say in terms of local or more than local need and the history to the borough. What AD 52 A and B were looking to do was to get a comprehensive sort of data set for exactly what has happened, exactly what is proposed, to avoid the situation where the data presents only a partial picture, say, of stuff that quote unquote relates to local need. So that's the reason for the evidence base being clear. The next stage, obviously, is to look at whether the requirement is an appropriate basis, informed by that evidence. So it's more of an evidence base rather than a directive policy, as I understand it. That was the sort of the history that's led us to this point. And what we're now talking about is obviously whether those figures are accurate at 2018, 2019 or subsequently. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So on the core 42 point, I will ask the council whether they would be content with some further information from Mr. Lever in terms of the precise figures there, but we've heard not a substantial or significant difference just numerically. But the main point that we come back to, and it may be actually advisable to get Mr. Best's view. Mr. Lever has said that if you look at the 16.8 hectares that is attributed to the, can I call it the hospital redevelopment? Will that be okay? Only, in fact, 2.5 hectares should be, or around that, should be counted towards supply on the basis of a 40% plot ratio, consistent with the GL Hearn study that looked at what floor space is required. I think it was GL Hearn. I may have got that wrong. Mr. Best, did you want to add anything to that before I put that point to the council?
Yes, thank you, sir. Just a point of clarification that I think Mr. Lever helpfully highlighted. I don't have the exact figure to hand, but his reference to 2.5 hectares is probably about the right proportion. Just to clarify, and we don't have a plan in front of us, but I can provide one separately and share that with Ms. Barrett and Mr. Dittman just to get that agreed. But the red line application, which is the derivation of the 16.83 hectares, as far as I'm aware, included an area of the hospital site, let's call it, which included the listed building of Coleshill Hall, what I am now called Coleshill Manor. And then there were some outbuildings which were former hospital buildings which were demolished, and that's where the planning permission of 10,000 square metres sits. So there are there's the existing building that was constructed as IM's headquarters. I think Mr. Dittman called it earlier the Subaru headquarters, but it was the headquarters of IM Group, of which IM Properties is a part. That was about 3,500 square metres of that 10,000. So I referenced about a third has been built out, and the 2/3, which is circa 6,500, 7,000 square metres, hasn't yet been built out. And therefore is an extant planning permission, and that's why that site still exists, because obviously it's part implemented. The former hospital listed building was converted into offices and has been used as offices and continues to be used as offices. IM have vacated their building and have moved to the gate in Solihull, because that building will be demolished as part of the HS2 construction. And then the HS2 works run through the balance of the site, which has planning permission. So part of it is lost to HS2 and part of it remains. So any future development of that site would require some reworked planning permission in whatever form that took. And I go back to the point, I welcome Mr. Dittman's statement about how the council would apply MM61. So this isn't about what might happen in the future. All we're saying is what the situation is now on the ground, is that's an area of 16.83 hectares, which is largely greenbelt and open parkland setting for the hall, and a modest amount of development area, which, as I say, could well be around 2.5 to 3 hectares in reality. So I think the point comes back to, is 16.83 hectares a fair reflection of what that site will contribute? And I agree with Mr. Lever's point that obviously the derivation of the need was based on a labour demand approach. So the floor space and then the land areas requirement was based on, you know, the yield that land would provide in terms of jobs. And clearly the yield in terms of jobs from 16.83 hectares of largely greenbelt parkland is not going to be as great as an equivalent amount of land on a business park or an industrial estate or a new site. So that's the only point I'm trying to make here, which is about, I think Mr. Lever used the reference apples and pears, and I think that's a fair fair reflection.
Yeah, thank you. That does.
I'm happy to provide a clarification note separately and agree that with Ms. Barrett. Okay,
thank you. That does clarify things. I suppose I have one question while I have Mr. Lever and Mr. Best on the line, which is if we look at MM61, so which is that the borough would support in principle proposals for the replacement of lawful building structures and uses. And if it is in AD 52B that the lawful use is 16.38 hectares, is the logical outcome of saying that existing use being only 2.5 hectares is that in the future, if you were to, for example, argue under policy LP27 as modified by MM61, that there should be provision for 16.3 hectares made somewhere in light of what has happened, that actually the council would say, well, actually, because you've argued it's 2.5 hectares, that is what should be recompensed, if that makes any sense. Is that potentially a consequence of what I'm being told to consider?
I think that's interpreting that proposed modification to quite a significant extent, sir, if you don't mind me saying.
No, I was just exploring.
Yes, yeah, but it says in principle, the replacement of lawful buildings. Well, clearly one of the buildings is the house that will remain on site, because not all of the site is affected by HS2.
Gotcha.
So what we're talking about is a proportion of the site that is affected by HS2, which is largely that containing IM House, which is part of that permitted 10,000 square metres, and the balance of that permission, which hasn't been built out, which is obviously not a lawful building or structure, but it is a lawful use in the sense of grant planning permission. I mean, if Ms. Barrett wants to confirm that IM can get 16.83 hectares of developable land in Greenbelt approved by return post, I'm very happy to pursue and proceed on that basis. But I suspect we'd all agree that, you know, for any development in the Greenbelt, there would be a very wide range of issues pertaining. I mean, it would still be a very special circumstances application when it was made. So there's quite a high bar for it to satisfy. And that's been the nature of our discussions over the last several years on this very point. I would make the point as well, we have made representations which clearly aren't being pursued at examination, but you will have them in front of you from us, asking for this site to be allocated. So the consequence of what is happening as a result of HS2 led us to say, well, OK, in light of what you're effectively now saying in MM61, allocate the balance of the site for development, so that we can see that there's a compensation for the loss of the part of the site to HS2, but the council has chosen not to allocate. So whilst I welcome MM61 and the suggestion that they would grant permission for replacement development, the request we've made since 2015-2016 for an allocation to replace the lost development has not been agreed to. So that would, in my view, have been the right plan-led approach to take, because we've known about this for a long time. Ms Barrett's right that HS2 didn't actually take over the site until October 2019, although that was due to be August 2019, but was delayed for legal reasons, which is not uncommon with matters of HS2 land acquisition, but was certainly known about from the point at which the Act came into force. Yes, you can count it in the supply, but knowing that it's not going to be part of the supply within 2 or 3 months it's a matter of interpretation. And again, it comes back to local plan timescales. Ms Barrett is right that HS2 construction should be complete well within the plan period. So something could happen to that site towards the back end of the plan period. But that goes to my point that wouldn't it be better to allocate it, so we're clear now what that means in the back end of the plan period, rather than say at some point in the future we in principle could replace a lawful planning permission somewhere on the site.
Okay,
that's a degree of certainty that I think the plan could have dealt with.
Sure, thank you. That's helpful background and context of the green belt as well. Thank you, Mrs. Barrett.
I think yes. In terms of it being an allocation and versus a planning permission, it is an extant planning permission. So I've always been one that if you've got an extant permission, then that is what you can then implement. And what we've tried to be is say we recognise that there are issues with the implementation of that, and that we're willing to look at a new application or a rejigged application or whatever that needs to be. But I just wonder whether in just going through all this, whether in terms of the employment land, we've always gone with gross site areas. It's the gross site area that we always go with. That is what we always base the employment land information on, is the gross site area. So yes, I can understand that there's this ratio of the 40 to 60% and things like that. It is a unique site because it is in the green belt, and so there are issues there. So I just wonder whether there's possibly, I don't know, a halfway house here, that in terms of the overall figures, that the 16.38 is reduced to the area that is outside of the HS2 land. So that would bring that area down. But my only concern is that is unusual for us to do that, but that is a possibility, that then that would reduce the amount of available land that is seen to be part of that consent, knowing that HS2 is on part of that 16. So I think it's 14 hectares, or that's what I recall, is left from the HS2. So as far as I'm aware, when the line opens, it's around about 14 hectares that will remain. But I'll be advised as to what is the best way to take this, because this is an unusual situation with HS2 taking away what has got permission. So and we've always said that we would look at the replacement of that one building. Part of the permission is still extant, it hasn't been done, so there is still that to go. So I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer, sir.
No, I mean, that's I understand what you've said. Now, can I just check before I I come back to Mr. Lever and have a think about that. Are there any other? So I've heard about Core 42. I've heard about Coleshill Hall Hospital. Are there any other under my paragraph 36? I just encourage anyone here to look at my paragraph 36. Are there any other points that people, just put your hands up if there are. Are there any other points that people wanted to raise in terms of those documents, AD 52A, AD 52B? I just want to gauge how much more discussion on that we need. But I can only see Mr. Lever's hand up. So, Mr. Lever, let me hear from you, and then I will come back to this point about how Coleshill Hall Hospital is
Apologies,
treated.
I struggled with the technology. I forgot to unraise my hand, but I think you asked me for a response in terms of talking about the natural consequences of this. But all I was thinking of really was to ensure that the supply is as true as possible, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And I think 16.38 hectares or something like 14 hectares after HS2 is still a gross misrepresentation of the employment development that site will generate. And I think the evidence base in terms of Table 8 needs to take that on board.
Thank you. And I think the point, so I'm just speaking aloud my thinking, I think the point that Mrs. Barrett raised was that as far as I understood it, and we did have a discussion about whether employment requirements should be calculated or set out, in the plan on the basis of particular use classes or square meterages of particular uses. So we've discussed that, but as I understood it, the floor space, sorry, I've tied myself in knots. The land for employment land is calculated on the basis of a plot ratio, and that has been applied fairly consistently to everything that's in there. My thought, and I'm going to ask the council this, is if a different approach is proposed in relation to Coleshill Hall Hospital, acknowledging that there are specific circumstances there that, as you say, make it unique, does that mean that in terms of, say, data integrity for all the other sites, that sort of similar process would have to be gone through in relation to AD 52B?
In my opinion, sir, if it was because of its unique situation, and it was made very clear that it's because of its unique situation, it's unique because of HS2 and everything else, then I wouldn't want it to affect any of the other sites. But for consistency, I'd prefer it that they were all treated the same, but I can understand if there's a reasoning for the fact that we treat that slightly differently. But I would prefer, for consistency, just to do them all the same. But
one further question then: are any other sites similarly affected by HS2?
Not that I can recall. No, I'm getting a shake of the head from Mike as well. So no, we can't recall any other sites that are similarly affected.
Okay, what I would suggest, and I don't know if Mr. Lever's hand is up again, but what I would suggest is some consideration is given to the specific nature of that site in terms of a sort of contribution towards employment space. I am mindful of whether that changes the data there relative to any other, but what I would suggest, and I do want to minimise the additional given the sort of the duration we're into the examination. What I would like is if Mrs. Barrett, you could talk to Mr. Best and Mr. Lever if required, and come up with, you may not agree on exactly the right amount, but some sort of range in which the kind of, given the specific circumstances that apply to that site, some sort of range in terms of what the accurate representation should be. I think that would be useful for me. I mean, I've heard the range as it stands, which is 16.38 hectares in terms of the sort of red line boundary, if I can call it that, in terms of the planning permission. I've also heard Mr. Lever's calculation, but actually in terms of employment provision, it's around 2.5 hectares if you discount various things, and I'm presuming that discount includes the line of HS2 and the existing hospital. But I think that would be very useful to do. When would I suggest that we have a look at it? Well, what I would ask is that you get together and you come up with a range of, given the specifics, what we're looking at, and then I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Best, I have you down in the afternoon session of Thursday under paragraph 69 as potentially wanting, is that correct?
That's right. I was just going to suggest that, sir. I mean, I've got the information to hand to be able to resolve this quite quickly, at least, and so far as the facts are concerned. I mean, clearly we might differ in our interpretation of the facts, but
yeah.
The factual position is to hand. I didn't expect it to go into such detail today, or in fact to take up so much of the examination's time on this point, so apologies for that. But no, I can get a document to Miss Barrett and seek to agree that by Thursday afternoon session, if that helps.
Okay, let's do that then. Thank you. Yes, let's come back to that. I've made a note, and generally what I do at the end of every day is I summarise the kind of the actions and the potential main modifications that I see coming out of the discussion. Let's come back to that under paragraph 69 of INSP 5B, which is the afternoon session on Thursday. But I mean, I think I've heard sort of both sides of the coin in terms of its kind of its accuracy in terms of AD 52B. So thank you. Now I see that there are no other hands up at this stage, and that means that we are on now paragraph 37 of INSP 5B. Who did I have here? So this was a point raised in the additional. So this may be for Mr. Rouse or Mr. Sargent if they would like to speak to it. But it's has delivery of employment land and forecast supply been calculated on the same basis? And as I see it, there's a different, or as the argument has been put, there seems to be a different approach to sites of less than 0.4 hectares. Would either, I mean, I've got the point about the kind of difference in approach. Would any representative of Prologis like to speak to that point? Mr. Rouse, was that?
Sir, yes, thank you. I don't really have anything further to say, sir. I think my representation sets it out, so can rely on ALP 45. Thank you.
Okay, commendably succinct. Thank you. Is there anything the council would like to say on that point?
No, sir, there isn't anything in terms of the flat rate.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be guided. Oh, sorry. Yes, that's the second. That's the second part of that question under paragraph 37 of INSP 5B. Is it justified not to apply a lapse rate? And I presume, I just want to clarify that there isn't a lapse rate or non-implementation rate of employment land factored into things as there is for housing.
No, sir. When we give things permission, they tend to get done.
Okay, again, commendably succinct, and I'll see if anyone has put their hand up at this point. Okay, so then let's move on to paragraph 38 of INSP 5B. Quite a broad question. I said, what is the effect, if any, of changing circumstances at examination for the plan's consistency with the NPPF 2012 in respect of employment provision? Now I have, it's been raised, and we touched on this in the discussion yesterday, that as mentioned in representation to the additional local plan consultation, there has been a development consent order made for a strategic rail freight interchange, M6 junction 12, I think, around there. And we talked about the latest situation in terms of an update to the West Midlands Strategic Economic Study. I think I've missed an S out of that acronym, WMSESS, which I heard is being prepared but isn't yet available. And we discussed that yesterday. Although I said that we could discuss any particular points that are emerging in terms of employment trends during this session. So now is the opportunity to do that rather than to refer to a draft study. Does anyone want to raise any points about changing circumstances at examination and relationship to the approach in the NPPF 2012? I've hopefully set out what I have on those particular points. But I'm just looking if anyone wants to elaborate on any of the points they've made. I've got Mr. Sitch. Anyone else? Mr. Best? Mr. Rouse? Mr. Hodges? Mr. Ham? Okay, let's let's go in that order. I was calling them out as I saw them go out. So Mr. Sitch.
Yes, thank you, sir. It's Mark Sitch from Barton Warmore in respect of, on behalf of Stoford. A number of points in respect of your question here, and you mentioned this morning that the plan should be based on up-to-date and robust evidence, and the context for that so clearly is the NPPF 2012, and you've included a number of paragraphs in your questions for the NPPF 2012 in INSP 5B. But for your notes, not wishing to repeat ourselves from the first hearings, but paragraph 17, the third bullet, is clearly relevant here. Paragraphs 20, 21, and 157, and we'll touch on 161 later. But that's sort of the context, and the change in circumstances since the first hearings are numerous, but in order. One is the council themselves, and this is set out in Stoford's response to the further consultation, which is ALP 27, dated the 7th of October 2020. So just in summary, the council themselves, in response to you, sir, in NWBC 25, refer to addressing pressures for economic growth and ensure availability of sufficient economic and employment opportunities for potential regeneration and redevelopment and reuse. And that really sets the context, and I think where the council are in terms of recognising there are pressures. The question is, how actually do we respond to those pressures and those needs? Those needs lead on to the point that you raised in terms of the recent development consent order, and I don't think you actually have that in the core documents, sir, unless I've missed it. But I think it would be helpful to you if you're happy to have that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For some reason, our systems, our IT systems, don't like each other, Mr. Sitch. So I'm trying to battle hearing myself at the same time. But I'm agnostic either way on that, because it is the DCO is in the public domain anyway. But yeah.
Okay, but I think it'd be helpful for the inquiry library and for others to look at.
Yeah.
And in our response of October, we set out there the Secretary of State's conclusions, the inspector's report, and really the findings there in respect of, whilst outside North Warwickshire, it does actually refer to the market assessment area adjoins, and the significance of that and the changing circumstances that we have got, and that decision being since we've had the first hearings. And there's a couple of helpful references there for your notes, which is paragraph 5.3.7 of that DCO, and also 5.3.49
of the report.
Of the report, yes. Yeah. And that's set out in our letter. Yeah. So and I appreciate for succinctness, I won't refer to those now, but they are of particular relevance in the context of the need that the area faces, and in particular that faces North Warwickshire. The further point is that in that decision, it confirms through that assessment by the inspector and the Secretary of State that the Birch Coppice and Hams Hall lie outside of the market area, and it says have a very limited land available for development, and that's paragraph 5.3.54. That accords with our understanding and the evidence you have from others before you that are going to speak after me. And there is a concern, as we expressed at the first hearings, the lack of available space for strategic employment, not local, but strategic employment, and in this case, logistics, large-scale logistics, and hence that led to MM35. That concern remains, and I think has probably been exacerbated since the first hearings, and you'll hear from others in respect of the scale of that need and the need to address it now, which goes back to your question. The last point is in relation to the PPG, and you have that referenced in our letter, but also I think in others before you. And again, we consider that the PPG is of relevance, is salient to your question in terms of what has changed since the first hearings, and references there around economic need and how authorities determine the type of employment land that is needed. Paragraph 25, how can strategic policy making authorities prepare and maintain evidence base about business needs? Paragraph 26. That is very important, sir, because that ties back to the MPPF 2012 and the reference I made there to paragraph 17. It's around business needs, and clearly we're in a situation here where there are significant business needs, and there are other paragraph references that are relevant, be it how authorities assess needs and allocate space for logistics, which is paragraph 31, and also the specific locational requirements of specialist or new sectors to be addressed, which is paragraph 32. All of those are additional since those first hearings, are relevant, we would say, and do support those paragraphs that sit within the MPPF 2012, which you are clearly considering this plan against. Yeah,
sure. And I think I would just, I mean, you've made a careful distinction between what has cropped up since the previous hearings, and clearly the basis for the examination, well, it's set out in the MPPF 2012, but also referring back to the MPPF 20, it's set out, the basis for the examination is set out in the transitional arrangements in the MPPF 2012, but referring back to the NPPF 2012. I keep on saying 2012. But the planning practice guidance references you mentioned there, and you said there was sort of relevance to the previous version of the NPPF. I know there is an element in the NPPF 2019 that they relate to. Can I just ask you to elaborate that point about their relevance to the NPPF 2012? And I think you mentioned specific paragraphs, didn't you? 21.
So clearly, if we're in a situation where we're in the NPPF 2019, we'd be referring to paragraph 11, or we'd be referring to paragraph 82, for example, which picks up the locational characteristics of employers, employment needs, and in particular logistics. Those locational characteristics, if you like, we would say, and then is still set in NPPF 2012, different wording, and obviously an important distinction that has been drawn out in the 2019 version of the NPPF, but they still remain in the 2012 version. So we would say paragraph 14 remains relevant because it talks about local authorities should seek positively seek opportunities to meet development needs of their area. That is not solely housing, that includes employment. In the context of the core planning principles, paragraph 17, the third bullet, and I won't read all that out, but it does say plans should take account of market signals such as land prices and housing affordability, and set out a clear strategy for allocating sufficient land which is suitable for development in their area, taking account of the needs of residential and business communities. And you'll hear from others following me of the clear evidence around market signals that you have.
Okay, great. No, that's very helpful. So sorry, just to interrupt you very rudely, but different wording in the NPPF 2012, but in your view, logically the same, they amount to the same thing in terms of looking at locational requirements and meeting needs.
Yes.
And in that vein, if I can press you, and we've heard about the development consent order, which I will, after we've finished our discussion, I'll turn to the council on that. And on this, in your view, is the plan unsound by virtue of failure to be consistent with the NPPF 2012 paragraphs that you mentioned earlier? And if that is the case, how could that be resolved?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And in terms of is the response that we gave in the first hearings, which was through the identification of additional strategic employment sites. The alternative to that was the MM35 policy. And the reason for that was because the council and Ms Barrett and Mr Dittman was the absence of the study, West Midlands strategic employment study, and that we know that remains outstanding. Very close, but remains outstanding despite everyone's best efforts to get there. But it will be out soon, and it will demonstrate and reinforce the first version. And clearly, with North Warwickshire being in Area A, hence the reference in MM35 to that, which the council have gone some way to address in their version of MM35. So if you conclude that we should wait for that study, then we wait for that study, which is expected shortly. The alternative is MM35. I think we say and others say that MM35 in its current form doesn't work. It does need further iteration.
Okay.
I know that's a question for later.
Yeah, indeed. You've preempted my point there. I think what I'll do is thank you very much. That's very clear, Mr. Sitch. I'll hear from you. I'll put those points to the council initially. I'll hear from the others with the hand up. Then we'll take a break at around 11, so we can all reflect on that and familiarise ourselves. I see Mr. Lever's just put his hand up as well. So we can reflect on what we've discussed and then come back to MM35, which was helpfully referenced by Mr. Sitch, which at the moment would, looking on NWBC 20E, introduce a new policy, LP6A, if made to the plan, obviously, regarding additional employment land linked to the West Midlands Strategic Employment Site Study Area A at the moment. So that's one for discussion under that point. But thank you for those points, Mr. Sitch. I will now turn to the council. The two thank you. The two principal ones, as I have it, are the bearing of the development consent order and whether the council can pop that on the examination website. And the second one, there was reference to changes to the planning practice guidance, which evidently relate to the current version of the National Planning Policy Framework, but Mr. Sitch's argument that they in fact relate logically to the provisions of the NPPF 2012.
In terms of the DCO, sir, yes, we can put that onto the website. If my colleague Sue will just ask for the document number, so she'll just go through Kerry to make sure that we've got that, so we can make sure that that happens. In terms of, I wasn't quite going to answer the question that you gave me, but because I'd thought of something else. But
no, that's fine. Yeah.
In terms of the NPPF 2012, under paragraph 21, the second bullet point, it does set criteria or identify strategic sites for local and inward investment. And I think that's where the MM35 actually does fulfill that. I know that there'll be the discussion on the exact wording, but that MM25, so LP6A, would fill that gap, because it does try to give the criteria of how we're going to deal with such a strategic site. But also, nobody throughout all of this process, and I think it was a question that you asked at one of the matters, was how much land should be allocated in North Warwickshire. And from what I see from the drafts that have been talked about of the employment study, that still might not even still give us the number of how much land is in North Warwickshire that is going to be needed. So there still might be a gap there, even though we're hopeful that that gap can be filled by, even if it was additional work or whatever, then that gap has to be filled, and we recognise that. And we'll be working with the Greater Birmingham local authorities in particular to try and bring that forward as quickly as possible. Because at the moment that study has been commissioned by the Staffordshire County Council and the 3 LEP areas. And so it's now actually working with the local authorities to try and make sure that it fits in with the planning system as well. I don't think anybody's quite happy with what is emerging out of it, so it's not quite going to give us the answers that we're hoping for. So I think that places the importance of LP6A, although we don't particularly wanted that originally, but we can see that there is a need to have that, and that would comply then with the NPPF 12.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Thank you. I've got that. Yeah, and life sometimes doesn't give you what you want, does it? Okay. Let's. Now, who had their hand up next? I think that the one point I would mention is that with going back, and this may preempt something Mr. Best potentially says, but as I remember it, there was some suggestion that AD and this is more for me. This is just so I'm explaining and sort of bringing people up to speed and refreshing what we did previously. There was some suggestion that AD 54A and 54B, which takes account of everything, should effectively inform the forward supply. And I believe Mr. Best, on that basis, during the last hearing sessions, suggested a rolling annual supply of somewhere around 20 hectares, in line with what has occurred previously. So that is, as I have it, one suggestion as to what the forward-looking provision should be. But I take your point, Mrs. Barrett, that there is limited, other than that, there has been limited sort of precision that anyone can suggest as to exactly what the steps should be in employment provision going forward. I take those points. Now, who had their hand up next? I have Mr. Best appears on my system to have come up first. Mr. Best.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, you've got a better memory than I have, actually, but yeah, I do recall saying that in a previous session. I think it was a legitimate question that Ms. Barrett had about what we are seeking, and I suppose what we've always been seeking is that there's a piece of work done to come up with the answer, because as consultants we can all give it our best shot, but ultimately what I'll be saying in a moment, I mean, it supports what Mr. Sitch has just said, and I won't, as far as I can possibly do so, repeat what Mr. Sitch has said, so you get new information rather than repeating. But yes, critically, this question of whether we're talking about strategic needs that need to be set by some higher authority, and there is no higher authority than a local authority at the moment. The combined authority doesn't have planning powers. The LEPs clearly don't have planning powers. The commissioners of the previous strategic study in 2015 had no higher powers, and the commissioners of the current study have no higher powers. So the only way in which we get anywhere is through the duty to cooperate at the moment, and we know what the planning white paper said about that. But nevertheless, what we're trying to find is a solution that can flow out of the duty to cooperate. And what we know is that in the duty to cooperate session, there were no authorities saying to North Warwickshire that they needed to find any strategic employment land. And yet at the same time, we know that there is a need for strategic employment land because there is a study being commissioned to look at it. And if it's included in the supply of sites as part of AD 52B or AD 52, just generally that suite of documents, as he mentioned, and Mr. Lever, I think, made the point earlier that it seemed strange that the original table in the local plan, it was only the local supply to meet the local need, that now it's sort of expanded into the supply of all sites in the past, but only the forward supply of local needs sites. Sorry if this starts to sound confusing, but frankly it is. So it seems to me that if the strategic needs aren't something that we've actually got a handle on after 5 years, and yet 5 years ago we said there was less than 5 years supply, it doesn't take a mathematical genius to work out that you're going to run out of supply before you've actually got the answer. So my point is, to satisfy the NPPF in this plan, you need to do something about it in this plan. And I agree that the alternatives are either an allocation or some sort of criteria-based policy. And you know from our previous appearances at the before you that our preference is an allocation, because that's the plan-led approach to take. A criteria-based policy for something of such large scale, I don't think is the right way about it. But if this examination arrives at a point where MM35 is the solution, and we'll go on to it in a subsequent question, but you'll see we've offered our alternative to that, and we'll get on to talk about that in a moment. So all I'm saying in response to this question is I think that in relation to the changing circumstances at this examination, and in relation to NPPF 2012, there are a number of things that I think have changed, which still support and in fact add further support to our proposition that this plan should deal with it through allocation. And if I can just briefly go through those quickly. In para 156 of the NPPF, there's reference to strategic priorities, and in our representations we referred to two documents of relevance strategically, one being the local industrial strategy, which was published in 2019. That quoted from the Land Commission of 2017, which we also made representations to, and urged action because there was an employment land crisis as significant as the housing land crisis, which is quite a statement, and that's quoted in the local industrial study. It refers to a strategic programme of sites being brought forward, but based on locally led evidence. I don't know whether there is a strategic programme, I'm not aware of one, but locally led evidence suggests that that should come from local authorities or groupings of local authorities. So I think I probably said in a previous examination session that in the absence of a multi-authority agreement across the entire West Midlands, it may well be suitable for whatever the outcome of the study is, for there to be locally derived duty to cooperate agreements between a handful of authorities in a key corridor. So the M42 corridor, as an example, might have an agreement between North Warwickshire, Tamworth, Lichfield, Solihull, Redditch, Bromsgrove. You know, those are the authorities along the M42 corridor. So it doesn't actually require a multi-authority agreement across such wider area to arrive at a solution. But if it's going to be locally led, my point is it could be led by North Warwickshire because there's already the evidence of demand in the area, and I'll let Mr. Rouse and Mr. Lieber probably talk about that from a market perspective. I then mentioned Recharge West Midlands, which was the combined authorities' summer statement in response to the COVID crisis. And again, urging action on employment land and specifically proposal for a new gigafactory in the West Midlands to support the automotive transition to electric vehicles. My main point there is that if there is to be a gigafactory, which is a large-scale industrial use, that's in addition to the strategic employment needs that have already been identified, because they didn't even contemplate the need for a gigafactory. So the pressing need for identifying large sites has got significantly worse since the examination last sat, and for reasons which are set out in strategic policy. So that's my first point. The second one is the one that Mr. Sitch touched on, which is para 158 of the NPPF, which talks about market and economic signals. And again, I won't say much other than to refer you to what I'm sure Mr. Rouse and Mr. Lieber will say with regards to market evidence over the last 12-18 months and the record levels of take-up of large, particularly logistics buildings, with the move to online retail. The third is PPF Para 160, which talks about working together with neighbouring authorities and the business community. And again, the private sector responds to the study, which goes back to a March 2019 workshop that we all attended, and all the work that has gone through providing an industry response to that study and identifying sites. The local authorities are well aware of both the demand and the potential sites, so we're not talking about things that can't be foreseeable. And that's why I'll also refer to Para 161 of the NPPF, which talks about plans dealing with all foreseeable types of economic activity. This has been entirely predictable, but we've been talking about it on and off in this examination process for over 18 months. So it seems to me that the local plan has nowhere to go but to deal with foreseeable economic activity that is evident by the take-up and demand within the boundaries of North Warwickshire. So I think those are the changes that have occurred during the examination that the local plan needs to address.
Thank you. That's very clear, and thank you for setting out the exact paragraphs. That's very useful for me in terms of my notes. If I can ask the million or perhaps more dollar question, the foreseeable future. Now, I know that the documents that you've presented, the local industrial strategy, land commission, there are various other documents, obviously, that we talked about in the first session. Is there a document that says what is foreseeable in the future? In terms of employment needs? That is potentially an unanswerable question. I'm expecting the answer to be no. There is no one document that looks at the foreseeable future. And I know that the second aspect of that question, that is what is expected. Is it from the West Midlands Strategic Employment Site Study version 2?
Well, as Miss Barrett said, we've all seen the draft versions of it, so clearly we can't talk about it because you haven't seen it. What is evident is it doesn't quite answer that question, sadly. which means there's going to be some further work required, which pushes it further into the distance of when we'll actually get an answer. And as you'll see in my later comments about the local plan review trigger, what is really needed is a policy mechanism. And on this, I would agree with Ms Barrett that simply a report that tells you how little land there is only one part of the question, and is actually the answer we already knew. The more important answer is what do you do about it? And if the answer at a strategic and a regional level is there's a shortage of land across the whole West Midlands and there need to be sites identified in the following market corridors, which have been identified in the previous study and are identified in the current study, then the question is how many sites per corridor and how do you go about determining where those sites go? So my view remains that, you know, the current plan, I think, has enough evidence that the take-up in North Warwickshire and the demand evident in North Warwickshire should suggest that on my basis of 20 hectares per annum, that's kind of a rough take-up, that if a plan gets reviewed every 5 years, then we should really be looking at probably 100 hectare allocation or allocations within this plan, because by the time the plan is reviewed, another 5 years will have gone by and we already have virtually no supply. A corridor which is, you know, demonstrably highly desirable from an industrial and logistics point of view.
Thank you, and thank you also for you know, for raising the important point that it's a tough situation. It's a tough situation for the council. It's a tough situation for me. And that what part of the process is exploring, if there isn't, say, that categoric evidence, what could be done potentially by way of main modification to the plan in that eventuality. So thank you. I think that's a very important point you've highlighted. Now, I am wondering. Some of those points are, I mean, they're reflecting on and adding to what we've discussed previously. I'm going to ask the council whether they would like to comment on those now. If not, we can bundle all those issues up, which are quite complex and sprawling, with any comments from Mr. Rouse and Mr. Hodgetts, and Mr. Han, I believe, has got his hand up as well. Would you like to say anything at this stage, Ms. Barrett, or shall we have a discussion in the round after we've heard from some others?
Yes, I think it is in the round, sir, because as you heard from Mike Best, that there isn't a figure that we can latch onto to say it should be X. So I think that's where. But the only thing that I would like to say is, in terms of the what has been delivered within the local plan, is more than the 100 hectares that was identified as the need that we needed to allocate. Because when you look at the plan is 2011 to 33, the Employment Land Review said that we needed to allocate 100 hectares. But as you can see, we've actually delivered 236. That's with planning permission and completions already, with a further 57 to be allocated. So we've already gone beyond that 100 hectares. And that probably then comes down to, is there a consequential change because we've changed table 8 to LP 6? So that I'll just put that out there as well.
I see what you mean, but if I may, I think that is that's I don't know who said apples and pears, but as I understand it, the Employment Land Review it did something in terms of regional logistics sites. So it either discounted those, or it considered what is the likely forward employment growth in the absence of those to arrive at that figure of 100. That's my understanding. So the sort of the Employment Land Review going forward is a separate evidential basis to AD 52 and 52A, as I understand it. It's a different methodology, if I can say that. So it's not I don't think it would quite be right to say that the two are showing the same thing. I understand the point. I understand the point that you're making about the overall volume or quantum, but I think the differences in methodology I will have to reflect on. But yeah, thank you. Okay, well thank you. That's helpful. Let's have a discussion in the round. I'll now come to Mr. Hodgetts, who I saw his hand up first, then Mr. Rouse, and of course, Mr. Han. You might want to talk at the same time as Mr. Hodgetts. I'm not sure, but let's go to Mr. Hodgetts first.
Thank you, sir. Actually, the points that I wanted to make were rather minor, and I think the more substantive points will probably be made by Mr. Han and Mr. Lever on our behalf in relation to this round discussion. But
well, as you know, I like the details, so that's go for it.
It's something that's been touched on previously by Mr. Best in his last points that he made, and one of the and in actual fact, I think you made a joke at it about it at the outset of the examination yesterday, that very little's happened since we last sat down. Obviously, in reality, what I'm talking about is the COVID-19 kind of pandemic, and as has been widely reported, the impacts of that in relation to employment and employment land and retail sales, online retail sales, has been quite considerable. It's been widely reported that online sales volumes have increased from roughly, broadly speaking, 20% in March 2020 and peaked at 30% at the height of the pandemic, and they certainly haven't dropped back to anywhere near the 20% that they were prior to, and it's envisaged that they won't do because there's a number of parties that have started shopping online and had a taste for it, etc. So it's difficult in the context of this local plan to really provide any documents which can help to underpin policy, because it's a live situation. It's recent, and there's been very little work done to kind of quantify what the actual impacts will ultimately be. But the point I want to make is that the importance of B8 and logistics in employment need terms throughout the whole country, but particularly in the Golden Triangle, of which the majority of North Warwickshire sits, has increased significantly over the course of the last 9 months and over the course of the local plan examination. And in terms of actual documents, I can point which would be useful, provide useful information to yourself, as well as perhaps useful to other people, and I suggest could be uploaded to the examination library. The only document I've seen, one of the documents I've seen published recently is by Turley, so Mr. Best will be fully aware of this, in conjunction with Tritax Symmetry, the industrial logistics developer, which is the increasing importance of logistics during COVID-19 and beyond, which was actually published earlier this month, so it's very up to date. There are myriad other documents produced by property specialists in terms of the impact on retail sales and the percentages, and how take-up has been increased quite considerably in the last 2 quarters over the long-term trend and the implications that will have going forward. But I'm sure Mr. Lever will probably touch on that in more detail, and I could probably suggest he may be able to suggest other examples which would be worth uploading to the examination library to that effect. But with your permission, I suggest at the very least that report by Turley and Tritax, which is a kind of very useful source of the impacts of COVID and the implications for employment land, should be uploaded and considered.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, As I think I've said in previous sessions, I don't want to overload the examination library with stuff that's relevant, but I wouldn't have a problem with that document, which looks to be fairly brief, as kind of summary of recent trends, clearly relevant to something fairly significant that has happened recently. So I would have no problem with that. I would, though, just ask the council on that point if they're happy for that to be considered as part of the examination.
Would they be able to send it to us so that we can have a look, and then we can make sure that we can get a number for it and get it onto the website?
Not a problem, Dorothy. I'll send it over to you straight after the session.
Okay, and provided that you're happy. I mean, for me, that's a sort of evidence-based document that considers trends in logistics, which obviously is an important part of what we've been discussing. So, provided that you're happy with that, that sounds good to me.
It just shows the need, sir. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I'm sorry. I was just pausing to reread my notes there, and I suppose the point, if I tie it back to the tests of soundness in the NPPF 2012, there is one reference, and the paragraph, the precise paragraph eludes me, but it says that plans should be sufficiently flexible to respond quickly to changing circumstances, and I think, as I see it, Mr. Hodgett's points go to that in terms of whether there is sufficient flexibility in the plan. So I've certainly taken note of those. Thank you. Mr. Han, Mr. Rouse. Mr. Han.
Thank you, sir. Hopefully you can see me. I think the reference you just made there was one of the points I was going to raise. I think it's paragraph 21 of NPPF 12. I think I fully endorse what Mr. Best and Mr. Sitch have said. I think that, and I won't repeat their points. I think more just on the test of soundness, and it's clear that there is a high but unquantified need at this moment in time. There is evidence from market signals coming from the LEPs and other organisations, which clearly points in that direction. And in order for the plan to be found sound in terms of the tests, to me in particular, NPPF paras 18 to 21 and the other references you've heard, I think it's really important to my mind, therefore, that in the absence of any allocations, and you've heard the council's concerns around the difficulty of, in their view, allocations when there's not a defined actual target and duty to cooperate issues. It just points to me the absolute necessity of MM35 in order to provide a sound mechanism in order for the plan to react. And Mr. Hodges has clearly pointed out just now that it's a moving feast, and studies coming out just this month have pointed to significant sort of seismic changes in trends around logistics and distribution. And in order for a plan to have some longevity, and bear in mind 5-year review is probably the minimum, that there's got to be that flexibility in order to react to the market and provide sufficient land. And therefore I think it all points to me that in the absence of allocations, MM35 is a critical policy, and I know we will come on to it as to the reasons why we and others don't think it's sound as presently drafted, but I think it provides a mechanism in order to move proactively forward. So I think that's probably as much as I can say, because I don't want to repeat what others have eloquently put already.
No, that's a very helpful reference to paragraph 21 of the NPPF 2012 in particular, responding flexibly to changing circumstances. Just mindful that we will come on to potential MM35, and when I say potential main modification, that is what they are at this stage. I suppose the question that I've put there has already been answered by a number of you. In the absence of potential MM35, would the plan fail to accord with the NPPF paragraph 161, etc., and therefore be inconsistent with national planning policy? Not undercutting what Mr. Rouse may say, I think the answer that has come through a number of points is yes. Therefore, when we come after a quick break to MM35, we'll be talking about some fairly, we'll probably be going straight on to paragraph 40, I think, which is the operation, how any concerns with its operation, phrasing, etc. So that's just a warm up for after the break. Now, I will come to the council after I've heard from Mr. Rouse if they have any kind of points to make in the round on what's been said. So, Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, sir. Trying to piece together the threads that are left after all of that. But just as an observation, I think Dorothy Barrett made an interesting point just now. I might just turn to that, which was that the council was planning for 100 hectares of employment land, and that was the perceived need. And yet already they've delivered 236 hectares and they're allocating another 57. The point being that need was massively underestimated, and the market has delivered 2.5 times as much as the need that was calculated. So that gives you an indication of the fact that you can't always rely on a need assessment, and it's quite difficult to predict the exact amount, but the market is strong. I was going to start at 21 bullet 3, which is where you've just been taken by Mr. Han in terms of your earlier reference. As I've set out in my representation, the council has clarified that these key policies are strategic policies, and the NPPF 2012 guides us as to what those policies should therefore be dealing with in relation to paragraph 156, and that includes the provision of commercial development and meeting jobs in the area. And in relation to those strategic policies for commercial development, the NPPF requires at paragraph 157 to indicate broad locations for strategic development on a key diagram and land use designations on the proposals map. So that is a specific requirement. And the paragraph 21 bullet 2, as we've already, I think someone's already mentioned this, anticipated needs over the plan period, which are emerging.
I think I think I will ask the council in particular. Sorry to interrupt your flow. This is just to flag up the kind of the strength, the relevance. You mentioned that effectively what has been delivered has exceeded what was forecast. So that's a particular point I would like the council to reflect on. But sorry, let's continue as you're doing, Mr. Rouse.
Sorry, so I'm just trying to thread together the parts of the NPPF that are relevant here. And obviously this flows into the next point in terms of discussing MM35, but paragraph 154 is clear that policy should be clear on what will or will not be permitted and where, and only policies that provide a clear indication of how a decision maker should react to development should be included in a plan. So we need to be clear on that. And Mr. Best has referred to paragraphs 160 and 161 already. And the key points there are that it's about economic markets operating in and across the council's area, not just within, but also across. And it's for all foreseeable types of economic activity, not just those which are non-strategic or local. So that's the sort of context. There's encouragement at 180, 181 for it to be assessed on different geographic areas in a continuous process. We appreciate we're not able to, as others have said, refer in detail to the WMSESS phase 2, but it does exist. I have a draft in front of me. The conclusion is a maximum of 4.94 years supply across the whole West Midlands of employment of land at a strategic level. And that, it says, is likely to be an overstatement. And the prime market facing locations for strategic employment sites is to the east of Birmingham, in an area that covers a geography from junction 2 of the M42 in the south, north to junction 10 of the M42, and then southwest to junction 14 of the M40 and east to junction 1 of the M6. On this basis, they identify 5 key clusters of sites, identifying figure 6.4, and recommend that be the focus for identifying strategic employment sites in the following 4 clusters. So there's pretty clear conclusions through that study of evidence of what the supply is, that it's not enough, that it is an urgent need, and as Mr. Best referred to, we're not talking new evidence here. The West Midlands Land Commission found that in 2017 and recommended very urgent action. This study talked about identifying strategic sites in those identified locations. So I think there is that context, and then Mr. Best has invited me to comment on the market side, which I will do, and I again set this out in my representation. But whilst much of the economy been the unprecedented economic collapse that we've had this year, with a 20% drop in GDP in one quarter, which is 10 times the level we've ever experienced before, is extraordinary. Against that backdrop of economic collapse, we have seen in the first 3 quarters of 2020, the national take-up of industrial and warehouse accommodation has exceeded any previous annual total. So in 3 quarters of the year, we've done more than we've ever done before in any other year. So Mr. Hodgetts was talking about this earlier. There's obviously been a shift in terms of the way in which product is delivered. People think about the need for logistics and warehouse accommodation being just because it's serving retail. It's not that. Every single manufacturing process in the country needs distribution and warehouse facilities as well. And so there has been significant growth. There's been significant growth in the market over as a whole, and therefore for this year to exceed that substantially already is very significant. But what we do see against that national trend is that the proportion of take-up in the West Midlands is declining as a proportion of the overall, and we see that as being a function of the lack of land. And this is, there's a lot of discussion earlier about Coleshill Hospital and plot ratios and all sorts of things. The difficulty we always have when discussing employment land is that if you were to come from a top-down approach, which we don't really anymore, but if we took economic strategies, they always talk about aspirations for growth in gross development economic values, and that is never actually correlated back to employment floor space. And if it were, it would then be relevant to look at plot ratios and what does that correlate to in terms of land, but that isn't necessarily done. But what you can see is that there isn't enough land here. So what we tend to do is extrapolate trends of take-up. And the danger with that is if you have a constrained land supply and you just say, we'll take that forward, that's what the evidence was of land that was taken up previously, we'll take that forward for the next plan period, it exacerbates the trend. So if you were undersupplied previously, you become undersupplied in the future. And I think that's what we're seeing here, where there has been constraint in the West Midlands. And in the last couple of years, we've seen the proportion of land being taken up in the West Midlands falling against the national position. And so this year it's currently at 9%. Last year it was at 12%. The long-term average ahead of that was 16% of the West Midlands being the share of the national position. So the constraint on land is affecting the ability of the West Midlands economy to respond, and that is a problem. And further evidence from our market assessment work, which we do and it's pretty comprehensive, shows that 3/4 of all industrial and warehouse take-up is in new development. So the existing stock, which gets churned,
it's not getting recycled. Sorry, did you know is not meeting that demand? That was your point. The existing stock is not meeting that take up.
Correct. So 3/4 of all take up is new buildings, and so we have to have land for new buildings.
Can I sorry? Can I interrupt you? I just you may have some more points to make, but just three things, if I may. You made the point that sort of take up is lower in the West Midlands than elsewhere as a function of the lack of availability. Presumably that is I can see the logic of that, but is the data there in that respect, that the cause is, I'm just thinking about what the cause of that lack of take up is, whether it is lack of availability or other factors potentially.
Well, I think it is, and sadly so. I think it's contained in the WMSES phase 2.
Right. Okay.
In terms of the